The Chicago Bar Association was created back in 1874 as just a general resource to help attorneys network with each other and be successful in their practices. The CBA chose to set up the insurance subsidiary because a lot of the members were asking questions about what types of insurance they should tap into. Who's the best resource for legal malpractice insurance, life insurance, health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And rather than sending those elsewhere, we figured we'd be a better resource if we just kept it all in-house and they had a familiar face to work with on a regular basis. And we think that it's very important to get the word out and let our members know that we're around to help as a resource. On top of that, we can work with any law firm or any attorney in the United States. When a law firm comes to us for a second opinion on their legal malpractice insurance policy, we're usually able to find them a lower price for the same coverage or better coverage, or in some instances, actually both. We can find a lower price for better coverage, which is obviously the end goal. Insurance is something that not a lot of people know the ins and outs of it, and maybe a smaller firm or a solo attorney needs that consultant to really keep them in line or to provide information to take it off of their plate. They have enough going on dealing with clients, collecting bills, doing everything that makes them successful in their profession. What I'm here to do is to be a resource and really to just provide assistance in something that they are not inherently an expert in.
Welcome to You and the Law, a Chicago Bar Association production that provides information on a variety of legal and policy matters of public interest. I'm Mike Al-Kharaki. I'm a partner at the plaintiff's personal injury firm, Leahy Hosty Al-Kharaki, an adjunct professor at Loyola Law School, and a member of the CBA, where I serve on the Judicial Evaluation Committee, Trial Practice Committee, and as the chair of the Media Production Committee that produces this program. I'm also a mediator in the CBA's new mediation service. On today's program, we'll be discussing legal and policy issues associated with returning to work amidst the ongoing pandemic, which we're all seeing can be a bit of a minefield for employers and employees alike. And we're very lucky to have two great guests with us. Lori Fuller is an HR professional at AbbVie, and Max Barak is a member of Garfinkel Group, LLC, where he practices labor and employment law on the employee side. Welcome to the show, and I'd like you both to introduce yourselves and provide a little bit more background. Lori, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me here today. This is an honor and a pleasure to be here. My name is Lori Fuller. I am an HR and learning and development professional at AbbVie. I have a passion for unlocking potential in an innovative way, so others are inspired to go higher. More importantly, I am a mom, a wife, a sister, and a friend to many. So I'm excited to be here today.
Thanks very much. Max.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's really an honor. So my name is Max Barak. I'm a partner and member at the Garfinkel Group, where I represent workers in all manner of workplace disputes. So typically harassment, discrimination, and retaliation based on race, sex, and all the other protected characteristics. People who have been victims of some form of wage theft or unpaid wages like overtime or minimum wage violations, whistleblowers, and folks who've had their biometric private identifiers taken improperly.
Sure, and over the last year, obviously, it has been a very different situation in the workplace, as we all know. And I know that one area of law that has been very active has been labor employment, because it is, very confusing. Right? And even when people are trying to do the right thing, it can become very difficult to know how to proceed. So why don't we start, Max, if you don't mind, by giving us a little bit of a foundation and giving our viewers a little bit of a foundation for what they need to know to begin to understand the topics the issues we'll address today. Specifically, the issue of at-will employment, just the basic sort of rules in Illinois related to the employer-employee relationship, and then we'll get into the issues associated with the pandemic.
Sure thing, Mike. So that's a great start. One of the first things I tell someone when they call me is the first thing we need to get out of the way is this baseline that you're an app for, unless you've got a union agreement or a contract that actually offers some protection, which most people don't realize they don't always, is that you're an at-will employee. So what does that mean? It means that your employer really does not need a good reason to keep you or get rid of you. They can fire you for cause or for no cause. And the kind of silly example I give people is if they don't like the look of the color of your shoes, if you walk into the office that day, they can say, you know what, I've had it, you're done. But that's an important thing to keep in mind because people often think, oh, I've been wrongfully terminated because they don't like or they don't agree with the reason their employer has given them. But one thing a lot of people don't realize is that you actually have a lot less protection from being fired than you think. It's an important thing to keep in mind because everything we talk about today, the protections we're going to discuss, the rights that you do have, you need to think of those as exceptions to the rule rather than the baseline. So what are some of the exceptions? Should I go into some of the exceptions now, Mike?
Sure.
Okay, so what are some of the exceptions we have to at-will employment? Well, there's something called a retaliatory discharge. So what that basically means is you've engaged in some sort of activity, you've complained about something, you've reported something that we as a state have decided as a matter of public policy, we want you to have that protection. So what kind of things are protected? Well, if you file a workers' compensation claim, so let's say you're at work, and the bad example I give, and it's gonna reveal me as having watched way too many Looney Tunes cartoons as a kid, but you know, if they drop the anvil on your foot, you're working at a construction site, you break your foot, or I guess if it's an anvil, it may get ripped off, but you get hurt and you report that injury and you file for workers' compensation and they fire you for that, that's protected. That's a retaliatory discharge. It's an exception to at will. Now, retaliatory discharge will also protect you in some other ways. If you engage in whistleblower activity, so somebody's dumping chemicals somewhere they shouldn't, you report it to the government, you report it to your boss, and they fire you for it, that's protected. More relevant to maybe what we're going to talk about today, maybe you're working in unsafe working conditions. Maybe you're being forced to work where nobody's wearing masks, or they're not telling people when somebody's exposed to COVID. Or, you know, your boss walks over and coughs on your desk every day and you say, you know what, that's really, which sounds crazy, but who knows? You know, and you say, wow, that's really unsafe. This is an unsafe working environment. If they fire you for that, that might also be a retaliatory discharge. So those are.
Let me stop you.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Let me stop you right there for a moment, and I want to come back to some of those issues, including OSHA and just general workplace safety. But I want to hear a little bit from Lori in terms of not exactly what your company is doing. We're not asking you what your company is doing specifically, but your knowledge of sort of industry practices related to HR. What's going on as people? It's a very general question. What's going on? What are you seeing as people are coming back to work, and what are some of the major issues that you're addressing? In short, because we're a little bit tight on time, but an overview.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of gray area right now. There's a lot of undefined spaces that we're seeing people respond to that's not just unique to where I'm at, but I think that's something that's going all over. For example, the idea of being able to work from home and proving that we've been able to do it for the past year. And so employees are wondering if they could just continue because they've been able to make it work. But some companies are wanting people to come back to work for the reasons that they offer. And so you have that struggle of, I've been doing a really good job, I've proven that I've gotten results, why can't I stay this way when you're requiring me to come back? So we're living in some serious gray area that's difficult too, because you have now added issues that didn't exist before the pandemic. So it's tough.
Sure. And certainly there seems to, I'm going to follow up on that just a little bit, there seems to be an overwhelming movement toward accepting more fully that sort of flexibility of working from home. So I'm sure, you know, one of the issues I think employers are struggling with, or at least sorting through, is to what degree, you know, we want to adopt this into the workplace culture. And obviously that might depend on the office or industry, but and either one of you can take this. Max, why don't we kind of go back to you just for a moment to keep going back and forth a little bit, but but what are you seeing overall with the understanding that you're seeing everything from you know, physical labor to office jobs and everything in between?
I think what Lori said, saying that there's a lot of gray area and there's a lot of confusion, I think is a good way to think about it, because what I'm seeing is a lot of people caught in the middle. Employers will issue directives saying we're going to be back at the office by this date. Okay, it's going to be by this date. Okay, it's going to be by this date. So I think unfortunately one of the hard things that we're seeing a lot of is just a lot of unknowns. You know, the laws and the regulations for what's safe and what's considered in keeping with public health guidelines really does change by the day. And I chuckle a little. I felt actually really bad for the folks who represent management and the other side and people in Lori's situation in HR, especially early in the pandemic, because there were not a lot of good answers for folks. And it really did feel like every day you were getting a new piece of public health information, new guidelines, you know. So circling back to now, you're right, like a lot of employers have seen their workers do very well from home. But you know, the workers on the one hand have gotten used to being at home, have had to kind of adapt their lives. It's been a year. So people's lives are not the way they were when this started. And a lot of people are being put in really challenging childcare and other situations, having to go back to, or having to start planning for going back to whatever the new normal is.
Sure. And let's go back to Lori just for a second, because, you know, you mentioned at the beginning, most importantly, I think you mentioned some aspects of your personal life. I mean, your language most importantly, but also in addition to that, it seems like it's something that you've taken some leadership role in your work setting, and perhaps sort of beyond just your company, you know, as you're kind of among the folks who are on the front lines of this return to work. So what about parenting? What about childcare? And how does that work into what we're all dealing with? Because there are a variety of concerns that arise there, from not just logistics and time, which has always been an issue, but also the health issues potentially.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so much that's so tough. If you go to any household or talk to any friend, everybody has a struggle, or they've gone through the unimaginable. And so it's been really hard to plan for the future because there's so much unknown. Whereas before it was, oh my gosh, these children are home and I have to now teach 4th and 5th grade simultaneously, all the while still delivering on my goals for the year. That's tough for the mothers out there, especially. And I don't want to exclude fathers, because fathers have had a part in this too. But when you isolate women in particular, naturally they become the source of everything. That many of my colleagues and also friends of mine have turned their jobs into being the gym teacher, the coach, the chef, the butler. And although we're not shuffling kids around to and from sports, we have now this added responsibility. And so what I've seen a lot of is that because we don't have those social outlets that we were once used to doing, there's a sense of belonging that's lost. And so we're turning more to Facebook to get our daily dose of social interactions. And so in the workforce in particular, what I've seen is that women just want to belong to something. They want to be able to connect with others that are going through the same struggle, and saying like, we're all, you know, we've all heard the phrase, we're all in this together, but that's kind of nauseating at this point, right? Like, we're over this. Let's get these kids back. Let's get life back to normal. Let's be able to go out to a bar. And so this pandemic really has done a number on many people. And I know that I'm speaking from a female perspective, but this is the world that I live in, right? Like, 1 week my kids are home, 1 week my kids are in school. It's really hard to plan, or for me to even know in my days how I'm going to structure my time. But one thing too, what this pandemic has caused is that there's no differentiation between home life and work and mom responsibilities, because they just kind of all interact. And so one of the phrases that we're adopting is work-life integration, right? How do you integrate it all so it all makes sense? And we're still getting used to that concept.
So that seems like, and I don't want to go too well, I guess this whole show is sort of about that to a degree, but the work-life integration seems like the new paradigm of work-life balance, which everyone kind of knew, it is already integrated, but now it's so much so that it's apparent that we all have front row seats to everyone's living room. I know we're not necessarily all at home right now, but we're conducting a lot of our professional activities and occupational activities, from our homes in a variety of ways. Not all, but that's happening quite a lot. I want to switch gears a little bit into the question of people have in their mind, do I have to get a vaccine to go back to work? Whether or not they want one, presuming most people apparently seem to want a vaccine. However, the question is, does an employer have a right to require employees to get vaccinated before returning to work? And I'm sure it depends, or I suspect it might depend on circumstances. But Max, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. So as a general matter to the question, can my employer ask me if I've been vaccinated, ask me if I'm COVID positive, if I've been exposed to somebody, because before we had the vaccines, that was the question. And now that they're there, can they require me to get the vaccine? The short answer is probably yes. Most of the time they can ask you to be vaccinated. Now, like anything else in law, it's not always a simple, is the sky blue, yes or no? Well, yes, usually. Sometimes it's purple though, except when it's not. So you can ask the question, you can require people to do it. If they say no, that's where it starts to get a little murky, because that's when you start getting into, do you have a disability, a condition that's recognized under the Americans with Disabilities Act as a disability that is stopping you from getting the vaccine? Like maybe you're immunocompromised or some other condition you have that your doctor's telling you, you can't get these shots or this shot if it's the one-shot dose. And then it starts to get tricky, because then the employer is gonna maybe want to know, well, why didn't you get the shot? Why are you not vaccinated? And that's when it starts to get complicated, because that's when they start asking questions, or if, to get to that answer, that's going to start to involve maybe people's religious beliefs or their disability conditions. So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's a little complicated when people do say no.
Sure. And related to that, and just in terms of workplace safety, to what degree do employers, and again, I realize this is context specific, probably, like most things, legal and otherwise, really. Personal protective equipment, masks, policies. I mean, what in general are you seeing? And I'll ask, Max, will start with you because it's more of a legal question, but it's more than that, really. And Laura, I'm interested to know what you think and what you're seeing on your end. But Max, why don't you start us off?
What's interesting is I'm sort of seeing the opposite. So it's not what I'm hearing and what people come to me and about workplace safety issues. It's really not that concern. My employer's forcing me to wear a mask, forcing me to get a vaccine. It's the opposite. I go to work and nobody's masked. There's supposed to be these company rules or laws, but nobody's masked. Nobody's telling us when somebody's exposed or test positive. Nobody's wiping anything down. And that, just to keep it shorter, that does tie back to the at-will stuff we discussed at the beginning. And where I'm seeing people hurt is people getting fired or getting into trouble when they complain about that stuff, or they raise concerns about, wait a second, guys, nobody's wearing a mask here. Nobody's being careful. Nobody's socially distant. You're coughing all over. What's going on here?
Mm-hmm. Lori.
Yeah, I think that primarily because there's so much unknown, right? There's an unknown of how is this virus going to affect me? It puts you on higher alert of knowing, like, is this available for me? And for those people that are planners and they like to know that everything's set, I think there's this unspoken expectation of, if you want me to come to work, I have these expectations that may not even be defined quite yet as what is acceptable and what's overboard, right? So the simple things that I would expect to have happen and that don't get met, that starts to cause a little bit of anxiety in the employee, but then also you get people that start to get upset with being back. Like, okay, you forced me into figuring out my day and to come here, and now here I am, and I don't even have what I need. So there's a communication bit and an understanding too of knowing, here's what is provided and this is how we're going to be accountable to making sure that your safety is our number one priority. And then vice versa too, for the employee to just fully understand that this is what's being provided for you. and this is the expectation. So it's hard, right? We're still defining this, and we overuse the term, we're building the plane as we're flying it at the same time, and this is a really good example of that.
Sure. Let me ask you, and if either one of you knows, I'm sure you got some ideas. What are there resources or guidelines or other sort of generally publicly available, information sources that both employers and employees can look to help navigate their return to work, what rights they have, what their expectations should be?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. There are a lot of really great government provided free resources and non-government as well that I really do strongly encourage folks watching at home to avail themselves of. So the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, in our line of work, we know it as the EEOC for shorthand, is the federal government agency that exists to investigate and address workplace discrimination based on disability, race, age, anything covered under federal law. That was not exhaustive, but anything covered under federal law, that's under their purview. They're a really great organization because what they do is they do put out great detailed examples of workplace guidelines. So if you Google just the EEOC's COVID guidelines, Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines, that gives great resources to both employers and employees on best practices. They give hypothetical, like concrete examples of what might be okay, what might not be okay, and it costs nothing. Similarly, the US Department of Labor has a lot of good resources like that. Really, any government agency that touches on workplace conditions, regulation, anything like that, OSHA, the National Labor Relations Board, those entities are all have put out throughout the pandemic pretty up-to-date guidelines as things change, giving suggestions about social distancing, masks, vaccinations across the board as the pandemic has progressed.
Sure. Lori,
Can
anything
you
to
ask
add
the
to that?
question? Can you
Sure,
ask the
no,
question again?
Sure. Yeah. No, Max did a great job going down a few roads there. And where we started was, are there resources that you're aware of that employers and employees may be able to turn to get a little more attuned to the issues? And Max mentioned a number of governmental and non-governmental sources. And it was pretty comprehensive. Maybe those were the big ones, but do you have other ones that you might add to that, or just other resources that you would advise both employers and employees to take a look at to sort of get on the same page in terms of what to expect as we return to work?
Sure. Well, I guess for that, I would say that each company is going to handle this a little bit differently depending on the industry that they're in and the requirements of return to work. But I would suspect that there's some sort of playbook that employers are putting out that have more of these guidelines that probably have to accommodate whatever the law is putting out. But then, I'm sure workplaces have some sort of guidance around that through what they deem as comfortable and appropriate for their space.
Sure. Let's get into sort of general principles that all employers should know. So let's start with that, because that will also inform what the employee should know. I mean, I don't want to just focus on the employers, but let's start with that, because that's kind of, that's who's determining policy related to return to work, right? So either one of you can take this. It doesn't have to be in any particular order, but what are some of the main takeaways that employers should be aware of during this return to work phase?
Well, I guess I'll start too. Just in my observations, the way that people have handled the pandemic is very telling of how they see their employees, which any company will say their employees are their number one asset too. So coming out of this is one thing that employees, as they go and pick their next line of work, they're gonna look into that. How did you, number one, handle the pandemic in the beginning? But then number two, how are you continuing to support your employees throughout that too? So I know this is a little different take on the question that you asked, but that is going to be top of mind for people that are seeking jobs. And there's a whole bunch of people that are out of work right now, and this is the one thing that they're definitely looking into. Eventually the economy will come back and we'll be able to have these jobs open up again, but it's very telling about how, how this past year has been handled by each of the companies.
I think something Lori talked about earlier on about circumstances changing and about people having trouble planning ahead and relying on what their next day is going to look like is something I would hope a lot of employers would keep in mind, because people's childcare and physical conditions have changed a lot. Illnesses or conditions that may never previously have been something an employer ever had to know about somebody have suddenly become front of mind. Conditions that you would never consider something your boss needs to know about. Now maybe you've got asthma or Marfan syndrome that affects your lungs, a tissue that might have the impact of affecting your lungs. Now you have things you have to worry about as a worker that you never had to think about before. So my hope is that most employers are mindful of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Family and Medical Leave Act for childcare and child health reasons, that people's situations have changed really, really dramatically. I think most especially with childcare, but also with their health. People who've gotten COVID are not all coming back 100% and may not be able to do what they used to.
This seems to me to sort of dovetail into the sort of foundational idea of accommodations under the ADA and other regulatory schemes that have long been a part of the employment situation. I mean, is that how does, I suppose you already sort of addressed the tip of the iceberg there, that once some of these underlying conditions may become sort of more relevant where they wouldn't have been before. But to what degree, what should employers know about accommodations in general when those issues come up?
Sure. So I think the baseline is you can't go looking for it. So if your employee isn't asking for something, it's not okay. It's not legal for you to start grilling them and asking them invasive medical questions for no reason. If the employee says, no, I can't be vaccinated, and then they tell you that, now we're in a different world. Right. So I think the thing they need to keep in mind is if an employee comes to them and says, I have a condition, you can't just put your fingers in your ears and pretend you didn't hear it or say, no, I don't care. You have to engage in the interactive process with them, which means basically working with them, negotiating with them, and trying to find a way to let them do that job, allow them to do it with added protection, as long as it wouldn't be an undue hardship to the business. Doesn't mean it's going to work, but it means you got to at least try.
Sure. And we're a little tight on time. Lori, you got something to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say what I'm hearing you say is we need to embrace the skill of empathy, right? We just need to know that this is totally new. As much as we want to get our employees back to work, we have to take the time to understand what's going on and not jump to conclusions based off of that little bit of information. I could tell you what's going on this much, but there's a whole backstory. And so, there's a push of, you must come back by this date and it's got to go this way. That's not, you're going to get terrible you're going to get terrible results. But if you have an empathetic manager that's willing to listen and understand, okay, here's where I can be flexible and here's where we have to draw the line, that level of empathy is really going to need to be played.
Sure. And I think we've got to probably leave it there because we're running out of time here. And I want to thank you both, Lori and Max, for appearing today to offer insight on this important and obviously complex topic that's changing really daily, right? I mean, I don't think that's hyperbolic. I mean, there's a lot that's happening every day that's relevant. So thanks for sharing your insight. And of course, we want to thank our viewers out there. Thanks for tuning into this installment of You and the Law.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.